So today I want to talk to you about carpal tunnel syndrome, because there's a lot of different myths about what carpal tunnel syndrome actually is, and a lot of people just interpret everything in terms of wrist pain as being carpal tunnel syndrome, which is not actually correct. So if you're suffering with wrist pain or numbness in your hands, then this video really is for you. So to start with, I want to talk about what the carpal tunnel actually is, because the carpal tunnel is actually a series of bone that exists in the wrist itself. So this is what we're talking about here, is this area in this part here. And what we really see is that there's a couple of bones, one called your radius and one called your ulna, that come down in that fashion. And there's a tendon that comes over the top of that area. And basically small little bones here are what make up the carpal tunnel. So what we end up with is a small area of bones that sit kind of something like this, with an arch underneath, and then through there, importantly, is a very important nerve called your median nerve, which we can see coming through here like this. Now the unique thing about the median nerve is the median nerve actually passes underneath that sheath, underneath that ligament, and then above those bones in the wrist. So it kind of goes through a tunnel. And this is why it's known as the carpal, being the carpal bones, and carpal tunnel, which is made through here. Unfortunately, what often happens in a lot of people is that these bones get moved apart, or there's some other form of irritation inside that tunnel that actually starts putting pressure on that nerve, which then affects the nerve as it supplies the hand itself. So this is the first thing we want to understand, is what is the specific pain pattern or sensory pattern that's associated with carpal tunnel syndrome, because it isn't the entire hand. So what we find with carpal tunnel syndrome is it's the median nerve that gets affected, and the median nerve predominantly supplies your thumb, your first finger, and your second finger. So we've got the first 3 digits on your hand. In some people, it will also supply the inner aspect of the fourth. So if you're getting pain in your 4th and 5th, this is unlikely to be the carpal tunnel. And there's another tunnel, another nerve that can be affected by that, which I'll talk to you about next week. But for now, really what we're looking for is pain and sensory changes in those 3 fingers at the front. So we end up with a hand that kind of looks something like that there. So as we spoke about before, it's really the median nerve that is getting affected. And this is the big main nerve that comes down the front of the arm. And really, it's all about the wrist itself. So when we're talking about carpal tunnel syndrome as such, generally we're referring to what is actually happening here at the wrist and the compression that occurs from there as well. So it's a lateral hand pain. So when we stand with our hands turned out, this is our lateral side, this is our medial side. So we're really looking at our lateral 3 fingers, not the medial 2 fingers, which is a different issue as we said before. The main causes for carpal tunnel syndrome is some kind of constriction through this area. So there's a few key things that we see that do this. For instance, if you have a fall onto an outstretched hand where you're leaning down and you fall onto that hand, that can often be a common cause of dislodging and breaking up that equilibrium and damaging it. Muscular imbalances, the really important nerve, really important muscle I should say, that we see often in our office, which is a common cause for carpal tunnel syndrome, and that's changes to your pronator quadratus, which is a small muscle that actually comes across your radius and your ulna through this area here. And it has the effect of turning your hand down, but to some extent it also has the effect of holding your radius and your ulna together and maintaining that nice arch. And the third most common one is actual swelling that enters the joint and enters the carpal tunnel itself. And this is something that we commonly see with pregnant women who are in, say, they're going through their later stages of pregnancy, they're getting a lot of fluid buildup, and it actually starts depositing into that area. Very interestingly, it's also something more commonly seen as people, especially women, end up in their 40s. So there's some thought that there may be some hormonal shift with ligament laxity or things like that that are associated with it as well. But just because you've got issues with this nerve, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's coming from this area here. So for instance, if we track the median nerve up, the median nerve actually passes through a muscle in the inner aspect of your elbow through here called your pronator teres. And it's a really, really important muscle that is also associated with turning your hand down. And the nerve in a lot of people actually goes through that muscle. So if the muscle is actually dysfunctional around the elbow, it's a common site where it can be jammed up and again often create that hand numbness and that hand pain. The other one that we look at is the shoulder, so through this area here. So when the shoulder blade is unstable and we're getting a lot of movement through the shoulder, often people will start developing numbness or carpal tunnel type syndrome only overnight or in the morning, especially if they're laying on their side. And we tend to see this is because the shoulder blade is not being stabilized, so the shoulder tends to run around, and as it does, it tends to jam the nerve going down the arm. And the final one, of course, is in the lower aspect of the cervical spine. So we're having issues with the lower aspect cervical spine. Sometimes that can irritate the nerve roots for the median nerve directly and impinge the nerve all the way through. So most commonly though, if we're going to really talk about the most common things that we see in our office with carpal tunnel sufferers, really what we're talking about is what I've listed here as the double crush syndrome. So your double crush syndrome really is all about having multiple areas being affected to produce an end result. So for instance, we might get 10% irritation through here, we might get 5% irritation through here, we might get 45% irritation through here, and we might get no irritation at the wrist at all. And what we see is the build-up of all these things together end up generating our symptom pattern in the wrist. So just because you're having wrist pain and just because you're having carpal tunnel syndrome doesn't necessarily mean you need to rush out and get surgery on your wrist. Quite often there are conservative things that can be done, and you want to make sure all of these areas are functional before you start trying to take a knife into things and open things up, because these things are irreversible in many cases. Anyway guys, if you have any questions with this stuff, or if you want to know more about carpal tunnel syndrome, just post up, send me a message, and we're always happy to help. And remember, let's keep adding life and quality to those years. Catch you soon. See you guys.